Okay, hi everyone. I'm going to dive straight in. Custom properties are now supported in all modern browsers, and this is great. It means that we're starting to see examples of people using them in production, but they're different from variables in preprocessors. And I've already seen a lot of examples where people are using them in a similar way without necessarily considering what specific advantages they have to offer. And that might include one European Web Development Conference as well. But that's okay. I think custom properties have a huge potential to change how we write and structure CSS, and to a lesser extent as well how we use JavaScript to interact with UI components. Now, I'm not going to focus much on the syntax and how they work, because what I think separates the best players of any game is strategy. So I'm going to focus more on the strategies today. Could I get a little bit of help? I need a cursor. There we go. Sorry about that. Okay, so custom properties are a little bit like variables in preprocessors, but they have some very important differences, and one of the first and most obvious differences is the syntax. So in SAS, we might have used a $sign to denote a variable, and in less, we use an @ symbol. And custom properties follow a similar convention, and they use a -- prefix to denote a custom property. So one other important difference that you'll notice here is that we use a different syntax for assigning a value to a property than we do for retrieving that value. So when we're retrieving the value, we use this little var function here, and that'll be familiar to anyone that's used things like calc or color functions or min-max, or any of the more sort of functional parts of CSS that are making their way into the modern language. So the next most obvious difference is in the name. They're called custom properties because they really are CSS properties. And in preprocessors, you can define a variable almost anywhere. This means outside declaration blocks, inside media rules. You can even use them as part of a selector. And all of those examples would be invalid with custom properties. So custom properties have the same rules about where they can be used as normal CSS properties. In fact, it's far better to think of them as dynamic properties than it is to think of them as variables. And this means that they can only be used inside declaration blocks, or in other words, between these curly braces here. And this means that they're tied to a specific selector. And that can be the root selector, and you might have seen this in a lot of examples, but it can be any other valid CSS selector, and that can include inside a media query. So similarly, you can retrieve the value of a custom property anywhere you would normally use a value in CSS. So this means that they can be part of a single value, or a shorthand statement, or they can even be used inside calc next to other sort of keywords and other values. However, they can't be used inside media rules, and they can't be used inside selectors. So that means that things like nth child are out as well, which is a little bit unfortunate because there's some interesting things we could possibly do with that. Okay, so that ends my crash course on custom properties. There's probably a whole lot more that you want to know about the syntax and how they work, such as like how do we use fallback values, and can we assign custom properties to other custom properties? And the answer to that one is yes, but this should be enough of a sort of understanding so that we can get to know some of the other strategies that I have in this talk. So cosmetic differences aside, one of the most significant differences between variables in preprocessors and custom properties is how they are scoped. So we can refer to variables as either statically or dynamically scoped, and preprocessors are static. So where CSS is concerned, static means that they're subject to, static means that we can update the value of a variable at different points in the compilation process, but we can't change the value of the variables that came before it. So you can see, even though I'm using the same variable name and targeting the same selector, the output or the generated CSS on this side is going to be whatever the value was at that time it was read. And this means that we could potentially read an entire like .scss file and determine what the output is going to be without knowing anything about the HTML or any other inputs, and that's not something that we can do with custom properties. So custom properties work differently. Where custom properties are concerned, dynamically scoped means that they're subject to inheritance and the cascade. And it means that this property is tied to a selector, and if the value changes, it affects all matching DOM elements, just like any other CSS selector would. And this is great because it means that we can update the value of a custom property using a media query or a hover state or JavaScript. And we don't have to change which custom property we're using. We just need to update its value with CSS. And I want to show you a little bit of an example of this, which is why I was struggling to see the cursor here before. So if I apply this example to my slides, you can see that the heading color has picked up this light salmon, and that's going to affect all of my slides, including the previous ones there. However, I can scope this to just slide 15 as well, and you'll see that none of the previous slides are going to be affected anymore. So, in addition to being static or dynamic, variables can also either be global or local. And if you write JavaScript, you'll know what I mean here. Variables can either be applied to everything inside an application, or their scope can be limited to specific functions or blocks of code. And custom properties are kind of similar. So, custom properties are by default locally scoped to the selectors that we've applied them to. So they're kind of like local variables. However, because custom properties are also inherited, this means in many situations they can behave a lot like global variables as well, especially if we're using them on the root selector. So they're kind of global. And when it comes to CSS, we have some things that are global, and we want them applied consistently across our application. Things like typography, spacing, colors. These are all examples of things that you might want applied globally and consistently across your application. And here's an example from the famous Lonely Planet style guide, and it's got a section called Design Elements, which is essentially about global concerns, and it contains things like the color palettes and the typography. And they have local things too. So for example, a button component, and that's in a section called UI components, and when we use those terms, we're often talking about local things. So there'd be variables for these too, things like the color variations, the different sizes that we might have for buttons. And all of these would be local variables. And this is something that we're pretty familiar with in CSS as well. In fact, we've created things like design systems, style guides, naming conventions, JavaScript libraries, all to help with dealing with this problem of global design elements and isolating them from local component concerns. And I think that custom properties now provide some new opportunities for dealing with this old problem. So, as it turns out, most global things in CSS are also static. Your brand colors, your typography, they don't tend to change much from one component to another. And of course these things can change, but where they do, it tends to be sort of a global rebrand and not something that happens very often on any mature product. And this is why I think it makes sense to continue using a preprocessor for static variables. So aside from helping keep sort of dynamic and static concerns separate in the code, it visually denotes static variables, and this means that you instantly know when something is going to change globally or when something's sort of more dynamic and local, and therefore we're probably using a custom property. And this will make CSS a whole lot easier to read and therefore easier to maintain. Now, there are a few small exceptions to this rule, and one of them is client-side theming, but for the most part, I would call this a 90% rule, and it's one of the most important strategies for working with custom properties effectively. And if you're taking notes, I think this is one that you should possibly write down. Okay, so you might think that given my fairly strong stance there on global variables being static, that by reflection, perhaps all local things should be dynamic. And whilst it's true that local variables do tend to be dynamic, this is nowhere near as strong as the tendency for global things to be static, and I think in many situations it makes a lot of sense still to have local variables that are static or use preprocessors. And that's especially the case for more complex UI components. But of course, complex UI components don't make great slides, so I've come up with a fairly simple example here. And again, I'm using the example of different size variations for a button component. Now, I use variables like this mostly just as a developer convenience, and you can see that I've got things like button small, button medium, and button large. And I prefix those variables with the component name so that I know that these are local variables. But you could use a different prefix. You could use something like C for component or L for local, or you could even prefix global variables if you wanted to. Whatever you choose to do, I think that it makes sense to differentiate between local static variables or preprocessor variables and global static variables. Now, if we take this simple example and I decide that I want all of the buttons to use the small size on mobile devices or small screens, we suddenly have a more dynamic sort of situation here. And this is something that means that custom properties possibly make a lot more sense. So luckily, we can assign preprocessor variables to custom properties. Now, you might be wondering what this little hash and curly braces around the variable are. And the reason for this is that $button small is actually a valid value for a custom property, and recent versions of SAS recognize this. So we need to interpolate these variables, and this is what this syntax means. And this tells SAS that you want to output the value of that variable and not $button small in your style sheet. And this is only needed for situations like this where variables are also valid CSS, or variable names are also valid CSS. Okay, so here you can see that I've started off with a button class and I've created a custom property with a size of button small. Now that class would be on all of those buttons there. So they all start off small, and then using a media query above 600 pixels, I'm changing the value of that custom property to either button large or button medium. And of course, I don't need to change the small one because it stays the same. Now what this results in is static variables becoming locally dynamic. So you can still use a mix of two, and if you're refactoring, this is a pattern you might want to consider. And then finally here, you can see that I'm retrieving the value of that custom property just in one place. And once again, it's only on the button class, which would be on all of those buttons, yet it's going to have a different value depending on the conditions above. Okay, so just a little deviation here. Hands up anyone who's written an overly complex SAS abstraction only to get their hands burnt. A few people? And hands up anyone who's gone now back to using SAS mainly just for variables. That definitely describes my experience with SAS and other preprocessors, at least initially. And I read a really interesting blog post on this topic recently, and it was on the Free Code Camp medium. It was called "Don't Do It at Runtime, Do It at Design Time" by Bill Sawyer. And he gave this example here. And I think this is really clever. What it does is it creates an array of letters of the alphabet by looping over different character codes and pushing them into the array. And obviously it's like a really nice, concise bit of code. It's smaller and it's going to be faster, obviously, than writing out all of those values by hand. But I agree with the author. The alphabet is not likely to change, and I want to see what's in that array. So code like this, whilst clever, isn't necessarily helpful in a production setting. And the dynamic nature of custom properties also allows us to create some clever and complicated abstractions. So this example here generates a modular scale. So a modular scale is like a series of numbers that sort of relate to each other with a given ratio, and they're often used for things like headings and font sizes and spacing in web design. And I could talk a whole lot more about modular scales and how we might use them because I'm really interested in them. But for this talk, what's interesting about it is that the modular scale is generated at runtime using using custom properties and the ratio there. So the value of each of these custom properties is calculated using that ratio and the value of the custom property that came before it. And what this means is we can change the ratio, and all of those custom properties are going to be recalculated live in the browser at runtime. And I think that that's pretty clever. And custom properties, they won't be and they shouldn't be immune to this kind of experimentation and innovation. And we do this with new technologies, and we did it with preprocessors as well. But in the long run, I think that readable, maintainable code is going to win over clever abstractions like this, at least in production. And in production, I might like to see something a little bit more like this. So here I can easily read what the value of each of those custom properties is going to be. And this is good because we read code many more times than we write it. And once I've figured out what I think these values should be, it's not likely that these are going to change much in my application. So that's why I think it makes sense to generate code like this at design time. But of course, this example here can still be improved. It violates the rule earlier that sort of all global variables should be static, and I'd consider these fairly global. I'd much prefer to make these preprocessor variables and then convert them to locally dynamic custom properties as required, using the technique that I showed you before with the buttons. And I think that it's also important to avoid situations where we name custom properties like this, font size 1, font size 2, etc. Because this can result in us situations where we go from using one custom property to a different custom property. And that brings me to my next strategy. And that is change the value, not the variable. And once again, this is one of the most important strategies for working with custom properties effectively. If you're taking notes, perhaps underline that one. So unfortunately, I see a lot of examples like this with custom properties. So here we have two custom properties, one called font size small, one called font size large. And then using a media query, I'm switching from using the small to the large one. Now this is exactly how we would have done things with preprocessors, but with custom properties, this doesn't make a great deal of sense. So with custom properties, a far better way to do this would be to define a single custom property, and we scope that to the component, and in this case it's the example component. And as a general rule, we should never change which custom property we're using for any single purpose. So with the media query, I'm updating the value of the same custom property here. And then once again, in a single place, I'm retrieving the value of that custom property. And you'll notice that the media query here is only used to change the value of the custom property, not to retrieve that value. And there's very good reasons why I've done this, and you'll see this pattern again throughout my talk. And it brings me to my next set of strategies, which is for responsive design. So, one of the problems with responsive design when it relies heavily on media queries is that no matter how we organize our CSS, all of the styles relating to particular components become fragmented across the style sheet, and it can be difficult to know which CSS properties are going to change. So, custom properties can help us organize some of this logic related to responsive design and make working with media queries a whole lot easier. So my first strategy for responsive design is if it changes, it's a variable. And what I mean by this is if you're using a media query or a hover state or anything else to update the value of a CSS property, perhaps you should place this in a custom property and move it along with the selector and the media query and whatever else changes its value up to the top of the document. If done correctly, this means that media queries will only be used to update the value of custom properties. And as a result of that, we will have a clear separation of logic from its implementation. And this means that all the logic will be at the top of the document, and wherever we see a var statement, we immediately know that this is something that changes in our CSS. And with traditional methods of writing CSS, there's no way of knowing this. It creates a link between logic and its implementation, and I find that incredibly useful. So the idea of declaring variables at the top of a document is not a new idea. It's something that we've done in many programming languages, and it's something that we do with preprocessors instinctively, and it's now something that we can do with regular CSS as well. So writing CSS in this way creates a clear distinction between the CSS at the top of the document and the CSS below. And I need a way to differentiate between these sections when I talk about them, so I've come up with this metaphor of a logic fold. So above the fold contains like all of the preprocessor variables, custom properties, and all the selectors that might change those values. And below the fold, it's highly declarative and straightforward and easy to read. And in fact, it feels like the kind of CSS we used to write some years ago before media queries and other complexities of the modern language. So this is what it might look like above the fold. And as you can see here, this section only contains custom properties, and more than that, it only contains examples where we're assigning values to custom properties, not retrieving them. You might have figured out that this is for a basic 6-column flexbox grid system, and I have a custom property there called row display, and then using a media query, I'm updating the value of the row display from block to flex, at which point all of those col basis custom properties are going to come into effect. So below the fold, I can see which CSS properties are going to be changed. I know that the row class is using the row display one for the display property, which isn't surprising. And I can see there too that the col basis value is used for the flex basis. And what's interesting about that particular example is the value of that custom property is going to be different depending on which of those classes is applied in the HTML. And it can make CSS like that a lot less verbose. We only need sort of one place where we're defining the styles, and I can look back above the fold and I can see what those values are going to be in the different situations that might exist within the browser. So writing CSS in this way is easier to maintain because all of the logic is in one place and all the declarative code is somewhere else. It's easier to read because we know what's changing, anything with a var statement, without reading and interpreting the whole style sheet, as many of us have become very good at doing. And what it will result is all the styles, all the design concerns being in one place for each individual component. And separating the logic from the implementation like this is, again, another important strategy for working effectively with custom properties. But of course, all rules are meant to be broken. And that brings me to my next set of strategies for theming. So throughout this talk, there's a lot of places where I've already argued against using custom properties for sort of global dynamic variables. And hopefully I've implied that sort of assigning custom properties to the root selector is in many cases considered harmful. But like I said, every rule has an exception, and for custom properties, it's theming. And I think that limited use of global dynamic variables for theming makes it a lot of sense. So theming generally refers to like updating the UI in some way. Could be something like the Twitter profile page here, changing the colors, the background image, your profile picture, etc. Or it could also be something more localized. So for example, changing the color of a note in the Google Keep application, or you might have used a similar note-keeping application like that. So theming usually involves compiling a separate style sheet for user preferences, and this can be difficult. It's also not very performant because it means that we might be re-rendering the page in many situations. So with custom properties, we don't need to compile these separate style sheets. All we need to do is put the user variables or the user custom properties up on the root selector, and these can be inherited by the default style sheet. So Ida and Doug are going to show you some practical examples of theming for accessibility later on, but I want to show you some strategies for not stepping on your toes when you're implementing some of those examples. So I think that we should be very deliberate and considerate about the use of custom properties when it comes to theming, because these global dynamic variables can be a lot harder to maintain. But luckily, custom properties are case sensitive, and since most of our custom properties are going to be local, if we're using dynamic global custom properties, it can make sense to capitalize them. So capitalization of variables often signifies global constants. And for us, this is going to signify that the value of this custom property might be set somewhere else in the application, and we probably shouldn't change it locally. I think that it can be useful to avoid directly overriding these global theme values, and that's why I've used an example like this. So here I'm setting the value of theme color to the value of user theme color, if it exists, and then this value here is a fallback value for when the user theme color doesn't exist. So if we're using theme color throughout our application, it's going to fall back nicely whenever the user hasn't set that preference. So I want to show you a quick example of this. Here I've set the value of the background to theme color. And see that if I apply this to my slides, the background color is going to change. Now I want you to have a think about what will happen if I make user theme color available in the body here. And the answer might surprise some people that we're still falling back to this default value here. And the reason for that is the value of user theme color hasn't been set on the root element. And that's where we're sort of inheriting this value from. So obviously if I move this up to the root, that variable is going to become available in determining the theme color. And that can be a useful pattern if you want to sort of restrict people from overriding sort of these more global values in different places in your application. But also, if you've got something a bit more complicated than this, it can be helpful to sometimes like expose those variables with a star selector. And what this does is it makes the theme color custom property available on every element. And then that means that it's recalculated for the body element, and we're now able to pick up the value of that user theme color. So I'm just going to delete that and put my slides back to the normal color. Okay, so if you want to set the value of custom properties with JavaScript, there's a fairly simple API, and it looks a little bit like this. So here I'm setting the value of the user theme color to tomato, and I'm doing that on the document element there, which is the equivalent of the root element. So one of the really cool things about this is If you have a technical design team, you can just sort of like assign these variables up on the root element there, and then they can decide how they should be used throughout the style sheet. And this allows you to make like large changes to how theming works within your application without having to touch any back-end code and without necessarily even having to touch any JavaScript. So that can be really useful as well. If you're retrieving these values from a database, or if you're using like a static site generator or even something like React or Vue, you can write these custom properties out to style attributes as well. And these are going to have greater specificity than any defaults in the style sheet. So these values are likely to be picked up if used correctly. It's almost like a sort of component level thing, except that the props here are sort of like passed in through the style attributes. And I find that this is a really useful pattern. I've seen it used for things like getting multicolored icons with SVG, and there's a whole lot of tricks you can do with this pattern, and I'm a big fan of that. Okay, so the final strategy I have for you is to start using custom properties today. Even if you're supporting IE 10 and 11, you can start using some of these techniques. So much of what I've been talking about today has to do with how we write and structure CSS, and this means that we can use tools like PostCSS to write this out to a static representation of the same code. I use a tool called PostCSS CSS variables, and I know it's a little bit confusing, but not PostCSS variables and not PostCSS custom properties. The reason for that is that some of those libraries, they can't determine what the custom properties are going to be inside media queries and other things. They treat them a lot, they treat custom properties a lot like static variables or a lot like preprocessor variables. But that first one will do a lot better job of that. Obviously, this technique won't be able to do some of the dynamic things, like some of the theming examples that I've talked about, but that might be okay. It might be perfectly acceptable for older browsers to fall back to a default theme, and you apply theming and customization as a progressive enhancement. If you want to know more about the specific techniques that I use for sort of generating this, come and talk to me afterwards, because I don't have time, unfortunately, to go into the build process. Okay, so I know what you're thinking here. I think Mike, this is great, but I haven't been listening. Could you just give me the whole talk again in one sentence? So yes, I can. It comes down to understanding the difference between dynamic and static variables in CSS and a few simple rules. So global variables are usually static. Separate logic from design. If a CSS property changes, it might be a custom property. And change the value, not which custom property is used. If you follow these conventions, you might find that working with custom properties is a whole lot easier than you think, and it might even change how you approach CSS in general. And yes, that was one sentence. I didn't use a full stop. Okay, so that's it. If you have any questions, please come and see me. There's some other examples that I would love to show people. Thank you very much for your time.